It began before dawn, not with a shout, not with a trumpet, but with a tremor rolling through the ground like the earth itself was turning in its sleep. At first I thought I was dreaming. The cold mud beneath my blanket felt distant, unreal. The trench walls were vague shapes in the dim grey light. Somewhere above me a lantern hissed, its flame guttering in the wind. Then another tremor hit, harder, closer, lifting dust from the planks above my head. A heartbeat later the world exploded. A thunderclap tore through the sky. So loud it stole the breath from my chest, so fierce it rattled my bones. I lurched upright, slamming my shoulder into the trench wall, hands blindly clawing for my rifle. Dirt fell in a thin rain around me. Men scrambled in the half-light, some cursing, some yelling for calm, some too stunned to speak at all. Then came the second shot. Not musket, not Confederate. Union siege artillery, the heavy Parrott rifles, firing from the rear lines for the first time in days. The blast rolled over us like a great wave, a deep, rolling boom, followed by a long metallic ring that faded into the dawn. And then another, and another, until the morning itself seemed to shatter under the weight of it. Callahan stumbled past me, pulling on his coat with one hand and holding his cap with the other. Sweet Lord above, they've opened the guns. Jensen was right behind him, boots half-laced, eyes wide and wild in the flickering lantern glow. What time is it? Is it even dawn? I shook my head, but the sky answered for me, a pale smear of light behind the trees. Not sunrise, but the glow of distant explosions lighting the smoke. The heavy guns roared again. This time the air seemed to warp around the sound, a low, sucking silence just before the impact, and then the earth heaving like a living thing beneath us. Men clutched the trench walls, steadying themselves as clods of dirt showered down. Someone shouted for the sergeant. Someone else called for water. But most of us just listened, to the rhythm of the guns, to the violent heartbeat of the siege, to the long-awaited promise that the war was about to move again. Briggs appeared at the trench corner, tying his cartridge box strap with quick, practiced hands. Up, Minnesota. Orders'll come fast. This is no drill. I nodded, swallowing hard. My hands shook as I checked my haversack and tightened my belt. The memory of Sam's last breath drifted up unbidden, the weight of his body in my arms, the night we barely escaped. The guns were speaking. The siege was breaking open whether we were ready or not. Another blast cracked the air, brighter than lightning, louder than thunder. Far beyond the treetops, a plume of earth rose from the Confederate batteries, a pillar of smoke and dust lit from beneath by the fire of impact. Men cheered. Others flinched. I did both. Callahan grinned through the mud on his face. About damn time, he said. But his voice carried no joy, only the brittle edge of a man who wanted something to blame for his grief. The next volley landed closer, so close the breath was knocked from my chest, so close I felt the heat of it on my cheek, even from across the field. A tremor rolled down the trench like a ripple in a storm-tossed ship. Our coffee tins rattled. Our rifles shook. Even the very boards beneath our boots groaned under the strain. Mills crawled out from under a blanket, blinking into the chaos. What's happening? What are they firing for? Briggs answered without turning. General McClellan wants the work softened before we advance. He wants Yorktown broken open. Jensen rubbed his jaw, eyes locked on the distant flashes. You think the Rebs will answer? Briggs paused. They might, but not for long. They can't match our guns. The bombardment rose in intensity, each blast closer, sharper, as if the very air were being ripped apart. Smoke drifted over the trenches in thin, dark streams carrying the smell of burnt powder and churned earth. Somewhere behind us a horse screamed. Somewhere ahead, another shell hit, sending a rolling cloud of soil skyward. The sky brightened not with dawn, but with fire. My heart hammered against my ribs. The siege we had lived through, endured, survived, was now collapsing under the weight of iron and powder. The quiet pain of the previous night, the memory of Sam's stillness, the heavy silence that had settled over our company was torn apart by the thunder of war reborn. I gripped my rifle tighter. Jensen met my eyes and nodded once. Not reassurance. Agreement? We both knew the world had changed in a single morning, and whatever waited beyond Yorktown would make last night feel like a shadow of what was coming. As the sky brightened with that strange muted dawn, I saw the camp with new eyes. The trenches steaming in the cold air, the sagging tents outlined in trembling light, the great guns rising like black silhouettes above the works. Smoke drifted low across the ground, clinging to every ditch and hollow like a living thing. It felt as though Yorktown itself had awakened with a groan, stretching its wounded body beneath the pounding of our cannon. The earth still trembled from the last volley. Boards creaked above my boots. Loose dirt sifted down the trench walls. Every man around me carried that look, wide-eyed, half awake, bracing for the next shock. Jensen leaned against a timber brace, breathing slow, steadying himself. He wiped soot from his cheek with the back of his hand. "You feel that?" he muttered. "Arrett'll shake the soul out of a man." Callahan let out a shaky laugh. "Good. Let the Rebs feel worse." But even he spoke softer than usual, as if afraid of breaking something delicate in the air. I steadied my rifle, checking the strap, adjusting the barrel pin, doing all the small tasks that kept my hands busy when my thoughts were too large. The memory of Sam kept rising like a tide I couldn't push back. His face, his voice, the weight of him as we carried him up that ravine, the way the night swallowed him the moment we had to leave. But there was no room for grief now. The guns allowed none. Another distant boom rolled over us, long, rumbling, heavier than the morning air, and then the sharp whine of a shell splitting through the sky. It landed far ahead, hidden behind a curtain of smoke, but the shockwave reached us, rattling the planks under our boots. Briggs climbed into the trench coat half-buttoned, hat askew. He looked carved from the same timber that held up the walls. Strong, steady, even when the world shook. "Headquarters wants every company ready to move at a moment's notice," he said. "Keep your gear tight. Stay in the trench. They may send us forward to reinforce the line." Callahan frowned. "Forward? Under this fire?" Briggs shrugged. "Orders are orders." I peeked above the parapet, just enough to see the torn landscape ahead. The Confederate works were shrouded in smoke, the earth tossing upward in dark clouds as our shots tore into their redoubts. Dirt, timber, and something else, something too far away to name, rose in each blast. Somewhere in those earthworks, men were huddled deep in bomb-proof pits, praying their wooden supports held. I knew that fear. The gun crews behind us shouted orders, their voices blending with the thunder of their work. 2 men heaved a shell as big as a child into the mouth of a Parrott rifle. Another rammed it home with a long wooden staff. Smoke burst in a cloud as the primer sparked. Then the blast, the world squeezing tight for one impossible second, and the recoil rocking the ground. Jensen rubbed at his ear. "God help the men on the receiving end," he muttered. I didn't answer. The way he said it, soft, almost regretful, told me he was thinking of Sam, too. Harding strode down the trench, boots caked in drying mud, eyes sharp despite the sleepless night etched on his face. "Company, listen up," he called. "Keep your heads down. No one climbs the parapet without orders. Engineers are moving forward. We're holding position until they signal the advance." Someone farther down the trench shouted, "Advance? Into that?" Harding didn't pause. "That's the Army's business. Yours is to stand ready." A sudden series of blasts shook the left flank, closer this time, violent enough to send a shower of dirt clattering down the trench. Mills ducked instinctively. "Rebs answering?" Briggs listened for a moment, then shook his head. "No, that's still our guns. All ours." A strange silence followed. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that settles between shocks, heavy as wet wool. Then faintly, from far ahead, the echoes of Confederate gunfire whispered through the smoke, sporadic, uneven. Callahan spat into the mud. "They ain't firing back, not like they should." Jensen nodded slowly. "Maybe they're pulling out. Maybe this bombardment broke something." Briggs frowned. "Or maybe they're saving powder. Don't assume." But something in the air did feel different, like the siege itself was shifting under our feet. A short while later, a runner appeared, breathless, mud-spattered, carrying a crumpled note. He slid into the trench, saluted Harding, then moved on toward the next company. Harding read the note quickly, lips pressing thin. "Engineers report a breach forming near the eastern redoubt," he called out. "Prepare to shift position when ordered. Keep everything ready." Briggs looked at us. "You heard him. Check your cartridges. Fill your canteens. We might be moving sooner than we think." My hands worked automatically, checking powder, running my thumb over the brass cap box, tightening the strap of my haversack. Every movement felt heavy but certain, as if this morning, terrifying as it was, belonged to something inevitable. Callahan nudged me gently. "You all right?" I swallowed. "I will be." He nodded, not pressing further. The guns fired again, a long rolling volley, each shot tearing a fresh wound into the earth miles ahead. Smoke drifted over us in thick bands, stinging the eyes, settling into every crease of our clothing. The morning sun tried to break through, but the haze swallowed it whole, leaving only a muted glow behind the drifting clouds. It felt like standing inside a furnace's breath, warm, smoky, restless. And beneath it all, beneath the thunder and commands and running men, one truth pressed in: Yorktown would not stand much longer. And when it fell, we would have to move, and fight, and march toward whatever waited beyond. Perhaps that was the strangest part of all. Standing in the middle of a moment you knew would change everything, but not knowing what shape that change would take. I gripped my rifle tighter, steadied my breath, and watched the enemy lines disappear beneath another wall of smoke. The siege was ending. The march to the next battle had already begun, whether any of us knew it yet. By mid-morning, the bombardment had grown into something monstrous, a steady, rolling thunder that swallowed every other sound on earth. The air trembled with each blast. The ground shook as if restless under our boots. Even our thoughts felt louder, rattling in our skulls with every concussion. Smoke drifted through the trenches in thick grey bands, clinging to coats and stinging the eyes. Every man moved slower, heavier, as though wading through a dream we hadn't chosen. Jensen leaned against the trench wall, hands covering his ears. "Can't hear myself think," he muttered. His voice sounded dull, wrapped in cotton. Callahan barked back, "Then quit trying, it'll only make matters worse." But even his attempt at humor fell flat beneath the roar. A fresh volley erupted behind us, 3 Parrott rifles firing in close succession, their shockwaves slamming through the trench like fists through wet canvas. Tools rattled, canteens bounced, dust sifted down in thin curtains. Mills scrambled to steady a stack of planks that had begun sliding toward him. "They're going to bring the whole works down on our heads," he said, eyes wide. "God help the poor devils in Yorktown." Briggs, ever the anchor, shook his head. "It's war, son. Better the dirt falls on them than on us." Another shell screamed overhead. We ducked instinctively, though it was yards above us. A heartbeat later it landed somewhere beyond the Confederate line, a deep, distant boom followed by a rising column of dark earth. The engineers arrived soon after, carrying shovels, planks, and coils of rope. Their faces were coated in soot, sleeves rolled, voices firm despite the chaos. One called out, "Trench is slipping near the east end. Need steady hands to shore it up." Briggs didn't wait for orders. "You heard him. Minnesota, grab timbers and follow." We moved, not quickly, for the footing was uneven and the shaking earth made every step uncertain, but with practiced purpose. The eastern section of the trench had begun to bow inward. Mud bulged like a swollen wound, threatening to burst and bury the walkway. 2 engineers were already knee-deep in muck, driving stakes into the ground. "Get those planks braced tight," one shouted over the thunder. "We lose this wall and we all go under." Callahan and I dropped into place, pressing long timbers against the sagging earth while the engineers hammered crossbeams into position. The work was frantic but careful, the kind where a single slip could cost a man more than fingers. A shell must have landed close. The blast wave hit us like a gust of invisible wind, knocking dirt loose in clumps. Mills slipped, nearly falling face first into the mud, but Briggs grabbed his collar and hauled him upright. "Keep steady. We're not done yet." Sweat stung my eyes despite the cold. My fingers ached from gripping the timber too hard. Every strike of the hammer sent vibrations through my bones, but slowly, inch by inch, the wall held. Smoke seeped through the cracks in the boards, swirling with the smell of fresh earth. Somewhere above us, more shells launched, more guns answered, each one turning the morning into a storm of iron. When the engineers finally waved us off, we collapsed against the trench wall, panting, filthy, shaking, the kind of tired that went deeper than muscle. I stared upward at the sky, a sky that had once held clouds and sunlight, now swallowed by great drifting sheets of smoke. The pale light behind them looked sickly, almost green. Jensen lowered himself beside me. "You ever think this'll end? Today?" I asked. "No, but someday." He nodded slowly, as if trying to believe it. Briggs wiped mud from his coat. "Keep your minds sharp," he said. "This isn't the end of the siege. Not yet." Callahan snorted. "With all that?" He gestured toward the distant earthworks where the air rippled with the heat of explosions. "You telling me the Rebs are still sitting there after all this?" Briggs considered the question. "I'm saying I've seen armies endure worse, rebels included." The guns roared again, a long, rolling volley that made the trench feel like the belly of a beast caught in a rage. But something in the rhythm had changed. A thinning, a slowing. I felt it before I fully understood it. A subtle shift in the air, a change in how sound traveled, as though the Confederate reply fire, already faint, was fading even further. Mills stood, leaning on his shovel. "They ain't answering," he said. "Not like before." "Hardly at all," Jensen frowned. "You think they're running low on powder? Or something worse?" I said softly. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "They may be preparing to pull back, or pull us forward." Harding approached then, mud splattering his boots, face sharp with urgency. "Men, eyes open. Scouts report less smoke from their guns. They may be holding fire or shifting position." Callahan asked, "What do we do?" Harding pointed toward the front. "We wait for orders, and you keep your bayonets sharp. If they're quieting down, it's not out of kindness." The bombardment continued, but the nature of it changed. Less wild, more deliberate. Guns targeting specific points, redoubts weakened by the morning fire. We watched the Confederate line whenever smoke parted long enough to show it. Sometimes a section of parapet collapsed. Sometimes a tree fell in a shower of splinters. Sometimes nothing moved at all. The stillness unnerved me more than the noise. As afternoon stretched into evening, that stillness grew. The Confederate guns fell nearly silent. Only ours thundered on. "Feels wrong," Jensen said quietly. "Too quiet over there. You can hear the absence." Briggs folded his arms. "Mark my words, something's shifting. Either they're bracing for one more blow, or they're preparing to slip away in the night." I didn't know which frightened me more. By late afternoon, the thunder had become almost familiar, a terrible rhythm that shook the world at regular intervals, so constant the silence between volleys felt unnatural. Men spoke less as the sun dipped toward the treetops, their voices swallowed by drifting smoke and the groaning reports of heavy guns. But as evening crept in, something changed. Slowly, quietly. A shift in the very air. The volleys grew farther apart, the tremors softened. The great guns behind us still barked, but each bark seemed to echo longer, carrying without answer. Then, for the first time since dawn, a full minute passed with no explosion at all. Callahan looked up, squinting toward the dimming sky. "You hear that?" Jensen frowned. "Hear what?" Callahan's eyes widened. "Exactly." The silence had weight, the uneasy kind that settles over a battlefield before men realize the danger has shifted. The smoke above the tree line thinned, revealing the faint glow of a deep red sunset bleeding into the haze. Briggs climbed onto a firing step carefully, then risked a quick look over the parapet. After a moment, he dropped back down. "They're not firing at all," he said. "Not a shot, not even skirmish fire." Mills whispered, "Reckon they're out of powder?" Briggs shook his head. "No, this feels like something else." As darkness thickened, the Union guns also slowed, not by command, but as though the gunners themselves sensed a shift across the lines. Smoke settled low, lingering above the fields like a second ground. A runner arrived from headquarters, breathless and mud-splattered. "Company commanders forward. General wants eyes out. No firing without orders." Harding stepped past us with a curt nod. "Stay sharp, Minnesota. This isn't over." When he returned, his face carried a tension I hadn't seen earlier. "Scouts report unusual quiet in the rebel works," he said. "We hold the line until further word. No one leaves the trench. Keep your muskets primed." Callahan spat into the mud. "Unusual quiet means trouble every time." Jensen didn't answer. He stared into the smoke-choked dusk, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, as though trying to find shape in shadow. The darkness deepened steadily, swallowing the last traces of color from the sky. Lanterns were lit behind the lines, but none allowed at the front. We sat in near blackness, listening to the faint crackle of dying fires far away. Ah, the quiet dragged on, too long, too heavy, as if the night were holding its breath. I found myself leaning forward, hands curled around my rifle, expecting at any moment the sharp snap of musketry or the sudden whoosh of a mortar shell. But nothing came. Nothing at all. Even the sounds of insects so common in Virginia nights seemed to have vanished. Briggs finally exhaled and murmured, "They're up to something. No army sits this still unless they're planning to move." Jensen nodded slowly. "My guess? They're slipping out. They know this place won't hold tomorrow under another pounding." Callahan shook his head. "If they were leaving, wouldn't we hear wagons? Horses? Something?" "Not if they're good at it," Briggs said. "Not if they're desperate." Hours passed with only the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional soft thud of a shifting beam in the works. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing slow, waiting for something to break, but nothing did. The night held its silence like a clenched fist. Near midnight, Harding returned, crouching beside us. "General McClellan believes the enemy may attempt evacuation. Engineers and selected scouts will move forward at first light." Callahan blinked. "Evacuation? You mean they'll abandon Yorktown?" Harding nodded. "If the bombardment rattled them bad enough. But we don't assume. We confirm." Jensen whispered, "So all this thunder, and they might just walk away?" Harding's voice softened. "Sometimes battles end not with victory, but with a man slipping out the back door. Rest while you can." He moved on, his silhouette swallowed by darkness. I leaned back against the trench wall, letting my breath settle. The quiet pressed around me like a heavy blanket, and behind that quiet the grief of the night before crept back. Soft at first, then sharper. Sam's memory hovered near, not as the broken form we'd carried from the ravine, but as the eager boy with a shaky grin asking questions, trying so hard to be brave. Jensen touched my shoulder. Gentle. "We'll march tomorrow," he whispered. "We'll have too much to do to think." I nodded, though the thought offered little comfort. The night stretched on, quiet, deep, unsettling, and somewhere beyond the smoke, beyond the ravine, beyond the shattered redoubts, an entire Confederate army waited in darkness, planning its next move. We waited too, rifles loaded, hearts sore, breath slow, until the sky began to pale with the first hint of dawn. And in that pale, quiet light, we would soon learn the truth of Yorktown's silence. Dawn came slowly, a thin grey light bleeding over the trenches, softening the sharp edges of earthworks and timber braces. Mist lay low across the ground, clinging to every hollow, every mound, as if the land were still unsure whether to breathe again. But even in that dim light, something felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. The great guns behind us sat idle, their black barrels pointed toward the enemy lines, but silent now, cooled to a dull sheen beneath the morning haze. Briggs leaned forward on his rifle, scanning the distance. "Where's the rebel smoke?" he murmured. "Should be rising from their breakfast fires by now." Callahan frowned. "Might be the mist hide in it." Jensen shook his head. "No. Something's off. I feel it in my gut." Harding arrived moments later, his expression set and purposeful. "Scouts say the southern batteries showed no movement during the last watch. We're to approach the first line of pits and report what we find." My heart tightened. We all remembered the ravine too well, but this dawn felt different. Not like danger pressing from the dark, but like an empty house waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. We moved out slowly, crossing no man's land, with rifles held ready, eyes fixed on the silent Confederate earthworks ahead. The ground was torn, uneven, cratered from yesterday's bombardment. Charred fence posts jutted like broken ribs from the soil. Smoke still drifted in thin, ghostly ribbons, but none rose freshly from enemy fires. Each step forward felt like a question, asked quietly, answered only by the hush of the morning wind. Callahan whispered, "Where are the pickets? Someone should have fired by now." Briggs raised a hand for silence. He crouched low, peering ahead. "Minnesota," he said softly. "Take Jensen. Check that forward rifle pit." We approached the pit cautiously, rifles tight, breath held. The mound of dirt loomed before us, its firing slits nothing more than black scars cut into the earth. Jensen looked at me once. Ready? I nodded. On three. We sprang up together, aiming down into the pit, only to find nothing. No rifles, no bodies, no packs, no embers of a fire. Just footprints in the dust and the lingering smell of extinguished smoke. Jensen exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. They left. We signaled Briggs and Harding. They joined us, scanning the empty pit with disbelief. Harding crouched, touching the dirt. Still warm, he said. They pulled out not long before dawn. Briggs looked towards the main redout beyond. Then the whole line may be abandoned, Callahan muttered. After all that pounding, they just slipped away. Harding stood, tightening his sword belt. It appears so. Report to headquarters immediately. The army needs to know the works are clear. We headed forward again, this time with quicker steps, though no less caution. The Confederate fortifications rose ahead, great sloping mounds of earth and timber, built with painstaking labor, scarred now by shell impacts, but still towering above the field. The closer we came, the clearer the truth became. The embrasures were empty, the gun platforms deserted. The long trench lines sloped downward into shadow with no movement at all. When we reached the main parapet, Briggs climbed first, pulling himself onto the crest with slow, deliberate care. He looked down into the interior. Then he turned to us, astonished. Empty, he said. Every damned corner of it is empty. We climbed after him, and for the first time since the siege began, I saw Yorktown from the inside. It was a strange sight. Quiet, colorless, almost peaceful. Bomb-proof shelters carved deep into the earth stood open like gaping mouths. Stacks of abandoned ammunition boxes lay scattered. Fire pits still smoked faintly where coals had died hours before. A few tin cups and blankets were left behind, as though dropped by men too hurried to look back. Jensen whispered, "They really ran." Harding nodded. General Johnston pulled them out during the night. He left only a handful of signals to fool us into holding position. Callahan shook his head. All that digging, all that fire, and they were already gone. But Briggs wasn't smiling. He studied the empty works with a stern expression. They're falling back toward Williamsburg. They'll stand there. Yesterday might have shaken them, but they're not beaten. His words settled heavy on us. We walked deeper into the abandoned redoubt, our footsteps hollow on planks that had once supported guns aimed at our own lines. The silence here was deeper than the night before, as though the Confederates had taken not just themselves, but the very echo of life with them. As we reached the far side of the fortification, a courier rode up fast, mud flying from his horse's hooves. He stopped abruptly, saluting Harding. "Orders from General McClellan. Prepare to march at once." Enemy retreat confirmed. We pursued toward Williamsburg. Harding nodded sharply. "You heard him." Briggs turned to us. "Gather your gear. The chase begins." Jensen groaned softly. "Marching already?" Callahan patted his shoulder. "Better than sitting under another day of shells." I tightened the straps of my pack, feeling the weight settle across my shoulders. Sam's memory followed me like a shadow, but the world was moving again, and we had to move with it. As we climbed out of the Confederate works and back toward our own lines, I looked once more over the empty fortifications. Silent now, but still haunted with the shape of the men who had built them. Whatever lay ahead, Yorktown was over, and the road to Williamsburg, muddy and lined with danger, waited like a beast we had no choice but to face. We began marching before the sun had fully cleared the treetops. The morning still wrapped in that pale mist rising from the abandoned rebel works. The air held a strange quiet, the kind that follows a long storm, a feeling as though the world itself was catching its breath. But the silence didn't last. By the time we reached the edge of the woods, the road ahead came alive with sound. The creak of wagons, the clatter of canteens, the heavy thud of thousands of boots beating the soaked Virginia earth. The Army of the Potomac was on the move. Columns stretched ahead, and behind us, blue coats rippling through the trees like a slow-moving river. Horses snorted clouds of steam. Officers shouted orders above the din. Drummers struck the pace at intervals, their beats echoing through the dense brush. Callahan adjusted his pack, already rubbing at his shoulders. "Marching too soon," he muttered. We barely slept, barely ate, Jensen gave a dry laugh. What's new? Briggs walked at the head of our file, steady as always, his coat flapping slightly with each step. The Rebs won't halt for our comfort, he said. They're racing for Williamsburg. If we don't press 'em now, we'll face a stronger line later. I knew he was right, but my legs still ached from the work in the trenches, and my mind wandered more than I wished it would. Back to the ravine, back to Sam, back to the moment we'd realized he wouldn't rise again. The war had not paused for grief. It never did. The road soon worsened. Rain-soaked earth churned to thick mud under the weight of the marching army. Each step felt like lifting a boot from glue. Wagons sank to their axles. Mules strained against the mire. Men cursed and heaved and pushed, faces red with effort. Harding rode ahead, pausing now and then to shout encouragement or adjust the column's pace. Don't break formation. His horse splashed mud with every stride. The deeper we pressed into the woods, the more signs we saw that the Confederates had passed through not long before. Ash piles where fires had been stamped out in haste. Broken crates. Half-buried rations discarded to lighten the march. The faint smell of horses and sweat lingering on the cold air. Jensen pointed to a set of deep hoof prints cutting across the road. These were made last night. They're not far. Callahan nodded. Close enough to make trouble, I bet. Trouble came sooner than expected. Around midday, the wind carried faint cracks through the trees. Musket fire, sharp and distant. Then cannon reports. Muffled but unmistakable. Rolling like distant thunder along the ridgelines. We halted instantly. Every man stiffened. Every conversation cut short. Briggs raised his hand. Quiet. Listen. The sounds came again. A brittle volley, then silence, then another. Slightly closer. Jensen whispered, "That's ahead of us. Rearguard action, maybe?" Harding rode back along the column, lowering his voice as he passed. "Skirmishers reporting Confederate rearguard near Fort Magruder. Keep formation. Expect engagement." Fort Magruder. A name we'd heard officers mutter in passing, often with a scowl. A fortress guarding the eastern approach to Williamsburg. A choke point. A place built to slow men like us. Mills swallowed hard. "So it begins." Callahan gave a tight grin. "And here I thought Yorktown was rough." The road narrowed as we neared the outskirts of Williamsburg, trees pressing close on either side. Smoke drifted faintly between the branches, carried on a rising wind. The sound of battle grew louder. Not a full engagement yet, but the scattered, growing rhythm of men testing each other's lines. Briggs checked his rifle, sighting down the barrel. "Stay ready. This rear guard won't roll over." As the trees thinned, a rolling field came into view, the edges scarred with breastworks, dirt mounds, and crude abatis. Ahead of them, faintly, we saw flashes, white sparks blooming along a distant line. Smoke lifted in wavering curtains. Men moved like shadows across the ridge. The battle for Williamsburg was waking. Harding's voice rose above the noise as he pointed toward the open field. "First Minnesota, forward. We support the center line. Keep your intervals tight." The order rippled down the column like a jolt of electricity. Men straightened. Hands gripped rifles. Hearts beat faster. I felt mine hammering in my chest. Loud enough I feared it might drown out the sound of musket fire. Jensen met my eye and nodded. A firm nod, the kind a man gives when he knows fear must be carried, not escaped. Callahan inhaled sharply, steadying himself. "Time to earn our keep," he muttered. And me, I felt the weight of everything behind us. The ravine, the siege, the bombardment, Sam's memory haunting each step, all pushing me forward toward the next unknown. The first cannon burst cracked over the field, sending a plume of earth high into the air. Men shouted. Officers pointed their swords. Drummers beat the advance. And as we crossed the tree line, with smoke rolling ahead and musket fire snapping like dry branches in a storm, I understood something I hadn't before. Yorktown was not the battle. It was the door. And Williamsburg was waiting on the other side.